well, unfortunately, there is a huge risk of a return to potentially even the sort of genocide that was seen in Darfur 20 years ago. It's very important that international attention, just doesn't shift elsewhere, because this problem is not getting any less, and it's not going to be something that we can afford to ignore for a whole variety of reasons. But the last flight out, I mean, yes, I've seen the FCDO announcement that this is the last exceptional flight. It looks that way indeed. That said, from all accounts, Port Sudan remains a relatively benign security environment, and who knows if there were a lot of British nationals grouped there in days or weeks to come, maybe it would be possible to have another airlift out of Port Sudan, but not from Khartoum. And that Khartoum is just going from bad to worse at the moment.
And on that point, I just wondered, as a former ambassador, the flying out of all of these Western diplomats. What sort of message? Well, not just Western diplomats, diplomats from across the world. What sort of message does it send the Sudanese, particularly those in favour of democracy and citizen rule? Is it likely to give them a sense that they're being abandoned by the international community, or is that just inevitable in a conflict zone?
I think there will be some who feel abandoned, yes, but I think they would also recognize the inevitability of it. I mean, it's not just a conflict zone, it's a battlefield going on in the capital city of the country where the embassies were located. Now, some have, of course, moved elsewhere in Sudan, and the UN, the head of the UN, for example, is based now in Port Sudan. And I believe the European Union ambassador is somewhere still in Sudan as well. So it's very difficult to avoid at the moment. But clearly, the last thing that can happen is that we give up focusing on Sudan. And I have no indication that the British government is doing that. I really do believe behind the scenes they are sweating very hard to reach a more permanent ceasefire, which has to be for humanitarian purposes in the first instance, but hopefully leading on to something more sustained and the resumption of a political process. The glimmer of that exists today. There is some indication that the UN believe that the parties have agreed to have a meeting potentially in Saudi Arabia to discuss the humanitarian ceasefire and the implementation of it, the monitoring of it, and an oversight mechanism.
What, from your point of view, are the wider repercussions of Sudan imploding?
I mean, some of the immediate implications obviously would be an even greater outflow of refugees, and some of whom would inevitably reach the UK. Already there's a significant number of Sudanese coming in the small boats across the channel. So an outflow of people would be one of the things. I think within the country as well, unfortunately, there is a huge risk of a return to potentially even the sort of genocide that was seen in Darfur 20 years ago now, because the tensions that exist between, for example, the center of the country around Khartoum and its peripheries, those and the ethnic tensions, those will be exacerbated, and already one is seeing an ethnic dimension to the violence in Darfur. So there's that. Geopolitically as well, it's I think there's no secret that Russia, for example, is trying to negotiate the construction of a Russian port in Port Sudan, outside Port Sudan. They want to have a Russian naval base on the Red Sea, and that is quite a gambit, let's say, to have a Russian naval presence in the Red Sea, which is the thoroughfare for about 70 or 80% of the oil and gas that comes from the Middle East to Europe. So it's a delicate situation. It is in the end, quite conceivable that there will be sort of messy deals and compromises made, and the current warring generals could either find some kind of compromise, but it's not just them as well, and that's the complexity of Sudan. There are armed groups representing interests around the country, South Kordofan, Blue Nile State, other actors in Darfur as well. All those armed groups also will have to have a voice in how this is resolved. But beyond that, the civilian population too. I mean, established political parties, trade unions, civil society groups, the ones who overthrew General Bashir in 2019, the forces of democracy change, if you like, they too have a very important voice, and they need to be at the table. So I can see, that there will be potentially a long, complicated, messy, far from perfect political process that holds the country together, if you like. But it's important that starts. Humanitarian ceasefire is a stepping stone, if you like, to that, and so important because the amount of destruction that's going on at the moment, the widespread nature of this violence across the country and concentrated in its capital is quite without precedent in the last 30 or so years. The scale of suffering now, looting that's happening, breakdown of law and order, key infrastructure destroyed, health facilities not functioning, food being looted from warehouses, and humanitarian agencies being attacked, etc. This is a sort of order of lawlessness and dangerous humanitarian situation that really is without precedent.